Hey, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today to be part of this. Like I was saying in our email correspondence before, I think it's great that this is happening at UVic, and I'm really happy to be able to be a part of it. I don't have any visual or video media, so you'll just have to listen to me blather on here for a little while. So the title of my presentation is Speaking in Persona, a shock satire and the grotesque burlesque of popular culture. So I'll jump right into it. Rock and roll has long been called the music of protest. There's my opening platitude for everybody. What I'd like to discuss with everyone today is what I think is an often overlooked or misunderstood form of protest in rock music and more recently in metal genres. So most often we find music is discussed in terms of its musicality, the merits of composition, mastery of instruments and vocals, production values, its conformity to whatever genre is assigned. However, I think in the contemporary medium of music, in the TV and now in the internet age, is one that merges music with poetry, with art, with fashion, cinema, theater, and with narrative. And initially, rock and roll and more recently in genres of metal music, performers have created personas who not only combine these arts, but who have utilized them to create poignant bodies of cultural commentary and satire. More often than not, however, I find that these complex creations are reduced to the sum of one of their parts, be it the music, the fashion, a lyric outside of its context, the art on an album cover, and the intended or complete vision of the work does not receive its due consideration. You might think of just how Jim Morrison insisted that he was a poet and not a musician. It's the music publishers and the celebrity-hungry media who supported him and who remember him most. The commodification and the technology that's made the distribution of musical products a rival to that of print media, I think has also made it a vehicle equal to the literary medium for the creation of poetry and of narrative, and also for artistic, cultural, and political commentary. And it's also built a stage for these personas who emerge as kind of children of these crossroads. So these personas, though, are more than just stage names. Performers who adopted an alter ego with a stage name as kind of prototypes, we can think of Iggy Pop, Alice Cooper, and many others. They certainly made their impacts and marked boundaries along the path, but there are performers who have gone far beyond this in the creation of persona. And these are careful creations, carefully developed. And I'd like to start off with David Bowie as a kind of complex prototype here. And I'm sorry, I will be talking about glam briefly. The albums The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and Aladdin Sane formed a conceptual narrative that was brought to life through a persona. And although Bowie once said that Ziggy was named after a clothing store he used to pass on the train, the character was much more than a fashion outlet. In a 1974 interview between Bowie and author William Burroughs, which was hosted by Rolling Stone magazine, Bowie explained that the narrative of the Ziggy Stardust album released in 1972 and the later Aladdin Sane album, which he referred to as When Ziggy Went to America, sorry, I lost my spot, were what brought this persona to life. And he summarized the story of Ziggy as a character who was in a rock band living in a world on the brink of the apocalypse as the world's natural resources dwindled. A world where adults had lost touch with reality and children were left to plunder aimlessly, unsupervised. And as this world lost its need for rock and roll, Ziggy's manager advises him to start singing the news. This is where the song All the Young Dudes finds its basis. And also on this album, the song Starman was one where Bowie found some of his early commercial success, was the story of Ziggy's dream, which was a kind of foresight of the coming of interstellar travelers, which he refers to as the infinites. Bowie explains that he conceptualized them as black holes or as a kind of energy being, but because this was too difficult to depict on stage, they became more human-like characters. The story progresses that as Ziggy spreads his message of the coming starmen, the hope that it provides to this fading world elevates Ziggy to the status of prophet. And Ziggy's downfall later occurs on stage and on record in the song Rock and Roll Suicide, where the starmen take over bits of Ziggy in order to solidify their earthly existence. The concept is science fiction, a dystopian narrative containing elements of eco-criticism, cultural commentary on gender roles, celebrity, politics, and media. In the same interview, Bowie elaborated on how he saw this kind of conceptual narrative developing in rock music. He said, rock stars have assimilated all kinds of philosophies, styles, histories, and writings. And he went on with an even more keen sense of foresight, I think, to say that, and this is still in 1974, saying that now we have people who are making it happen on a level faster than ever. Groups like Alice Cooper, the New York Dolls, and Iggy Pop. So Bowie not only saw this practice emerging in other artists, but his career also foreshadowed some of the backlash and protests which would continue to stalk these kinds of performers up into quite recently. The androgynous sexuality that Bowie depicted in Ziggy Stardust even inspired violent threats against him personally at times. Bowie laid the persona to rest in 1973, but as I'm sure you all know, has continued to make thought-provoking and controversial art. Over a decade later, the approach that Bowie had so effectively sketched out, uniting music with theater and satire through the voice of persona, was taken up by equally thoughtful and perhaps more antagonistic and over-the-top characters. Gwar, formed in 1984 by the late David Brockie, better known as Oderus Rungus, epitomized the creation of a shock persona. Like Bowie, Gwar drew heavily on science fiction themes, in addition to the mythos created in the works of author H.P. Lovecraft. And Gwar's backstory, the narrative that they created as a vehicle for their commentary and for their art, goes something like this. When, at the dawn of time, Gwar were created alongside the universe as the scum dogs of the universe, and they were sent forth to plunder and ruin at the capricious will of the universal master. When the scumdogs inevitably challenged their creator and were banished to the most insignificant mud ball in the universe, also known as planet Earth, Gwar not only continued to wreak havoc, not only created the human race, but continued to wreak havoc on them until they once again found themselves captured and frozen in the Arctic. However, as a result of increased pollution in our modern times, and also as a result of 80s hair metal, they escaped their Arctic prison as it began to melt. And as Oderus describes them, the mighty Gwar, stars of stage and screen, and carvers of stem and spleen, returned. In comparison to Bowie's Ziggy Stardust, Ziggy was quite subtle. Gwar and Odorous traded on their explicit satire of cultural violence, media censorship, and their parody of the cult of celebrity and of highly sexualized forms of media and entertainment. Although Gwar never experienced the mainstream commercial success, their performances, which were infamous for their scumdog costumes, spewing blood as well as other fluids on audiences, and sacrificing celebrity effigies, earned them a dedicated cult following. Now, while Gwar was reaching the peak of their infamy in the early 1990s, excuse me, Brian Warner created a persona whose commercial success and whose unrelenting criticism of cultural institutions would leave an indelible mark. His creation, Marilyn Manson, parodied the popular narratives with a satire that spoke through shock and an image that reflected a grotesque burlesque of what is considered mainstream culture and media. Today, Brian Warner is an accomplished visual artist and a recurrent cast member on the TV show Sons of Anarchy. The persona Marilyn Manson still performs, still creates art, and still speaks, but has become a more introspective observer, I think. In a way, perhaps the persona has endured its own life at this point to reflect upon, but in another, it also seems that even the shock of the Antichrist had a shelf life. Marilyn Manson also came with a narrative to tell and with a message to spread, but not from some nether region of the universe. He was nurtured to maturity from the most immediate and tangible materials of our own Western world and culture. Marilyn Manson, aka Brian Warner, said that he grew up listening to artists like David Bowie and Ozzy Osbourne because the administration at his Catholic school had banned them. With a keen sense of his predecessors and of the cultural climate, Marilyn Manson became arguably among the most controversial rock personas ever to take the stage. Marilyn Manson has said of himself that I consider myself more of an artist than a musician, and I think the music and how people are affected by it and our performance and me speaking to people, all of that together adds up to what Marilyn Manson is. The work produced in the first 10 years after Marilyn Manson's conception in 1992 formed the persona's narrative. While critiquing and satirizing many of the same cultural issues as Bowie and Brocky, the approach was neither as fantastic as Bowie's nor as comic as Gwar's, and the vivid, piercing, and kind of immediate nature of this work is what propelled Marilyn Manson. Again, perhaps what made Marilyn Manson so prominent and so threatening in some aspects was his origin and the aspects of American culture that are so often glossed as normative or as positive. Marilyn Manson, the name created from celebrity figures Marilyn Monroe and Charles Manson, gives an indication right off the bat of this. So the first album is where the story began for Marilyn Manson. Portrait of an American Family was the voice of a child in front of a TV. Came from a haunted trailer home filled with filth and fury that Marilyn Manson spawned in, where everything comes wrapped in plastic. Fundamentalist Christians, cash in hand, support the murder of abortion doctors. Childhood innocence and misunderstanding are contrasted with incessant graphic and sensational images proliferating from the TV in the center of every home. Performances for this album often took place on the set of a living room, an end lamp on a table, bassist Twiggy Ramirez in drag, Madonna Wayne Gacy playing keyboards and with children's toys, sometimes from a crib or playpen, and an appropriately adolescent-looking Marilyn Manson invoking images from the TV set. And this album not only provided a basis, but it also wrote the script for what Marilyn Manson's persona would eventually become in the album's most successful single, Lunchbox. The chorus, "I want to grow up, I want to be a big rock and roll star." A product of the reflection of the culture of the American family and determined to become a brutal satire of the celebrity status so coveted by it. The following album, Smells Like Children, was, to me, like a pubescent and psychedelic dream of the boy with the lunchbox. Performances in this era moved out of the living room and into a forest hung with dolls, as we kind of see the development of what could be a childlike character moving out of the home and into a new world. The album's hit single, a cover of the Eurythmics song Sweet Dream, was kind of like a carefully crafted bait in a way. And by the time the next album came out, Sweet Dreams had been making people uncomfortable regularly on MTV. So if Marilyn Manson had not already established celebrity status, the three albums which followed solidified it. Antichrist Superstar, Mechanical Animals, and Hollywood have often been interpreted by fans and critics as a three-part work. And curiously enough, they're also often read in a reverse chronological order. But whether this is the intended reading has never been confirmed by the author, and it seems more appropriate to me to interpret them in chronological order as successive points in the narrative stemming from the first two albums. So whereas Portrait of an American Family spoke with kind of incisive voice of youth, with wailing and trembling arrangements and vocals, and parodying and calling out the sickness but beneath what might be considered regular aspects of childhood and domestic life, the follow-up album, Antichrist Superstar, became more like the scream of the beast. It was a reply to the generation that reared it. Its hit single answered Lennon and McCartney's question in the song Baby You're a Rich Man, how does it feel to be one of the beautiful people? The album title parodied Andrew Lloyd Webber's successful musical Jesus Christ Superstar, but Marilyn Manson told the story of the worm and the task of overcoming his upbringing. The persona became the rock star celebrity, the spectacle, and the carnival. The performance set was turned into a cathedral where often Nazi images were invoked, Bibles were destroyed. There are old tropes at this point, but the presentation of this transformation was another a satire, very powerful and effective satire of American culture. The album drew not only increased popularity and success, but also an increase in protesters who focused their energies on silencing him, most probably unaware of the ironic role they were now occupying in the narrative. The follow-up album in 1998, Mechanical Animals, saw the persona react to his world and progress once again into the satire of the celebrity he had become. Drawing heavily here on the androgynous image of David Bowie's Aladdin Sane, Marilyn Manson emerged into a world of hollow glamour. The world of the dope show was one where sequence was illuminated only by a gray world in which it was surrounded. Then, on April 20th, 1999, the very things that Marilyn Manson exposed and derided through his persona and in his stories, the confusion of celebrity and death, the loss of innocence, and the intense isolation imposed by media were played out in real life. And the subversive persona was caught in the crosshairs of the media on the same day the victims at Columbine High School lost their lives. Marilyn Manson became a scapegoat of a culture that really couldn't stand to see its reflection in him. With no basis and in many instances with fabricated assertions, Marilyn Manson was accused of being the dominant influence on the Columbine murderers, driving them to commit their acts. Lawsuits, death threats, and canceled performances ensued, but Marilyn Manson gave no public statement on the event until years later in the 2002 Michael Moore film Bowling for Columbine. When Michael Moore asked him what he would have said to the killers, he replied, "Nothing. I would have listened to them because that's what nobody else did." The Antichrist has moved on, and sadly and tragically, the school shootings continue. The final piece in the narrative was the Hollywood album, released in 2000. A crucifix made of guns and a crucified Marilyn Manson with the jawbone removed illustrate the covers. And the album was a counterclaim against the culture that had scapegoated him. And the Guns, God, and Government tour helped to articulate this retort, I guess. And so what I have covered in this discussion is really only a brief overview of these personas and their work. But I still think, or I hope at least, that it's offered an articulation of their relevancy as cultural commentators and as touchstones. And I also think that it demonstrates, even if to a limited extent, how the confluence of artistic forms embodied within these personas should be considered not just as titillating fashion statements, as over-the-top rock stars, or as artistic crossovers, but as a voice as powerful as they are shocking, and as cultural satire that's equal to any literary, documentary, or academic endeavor to critique the same. And as we consider the makings and markers of metal music as a genre today, I hope this encourages people to consider the depth and the scope that can exist within it. So thank you very much, everyone.
Questions? Anybody? I have one.
Oh, great.
I've had questions for everybody, but it's not my role to go first. But, kind of riffing off of your end comment, I was thinking, could we expand that argument and say that in a way, all of metal is that kind of persona satire, even when it's not as explicitly adopted, that's part of its role is to. I was thinking, for example, kind of the dichotomy between Slayer at home saying, we're devout Christians, and the message that their music carries, and sort of that's kind of, at least for a lot of metal, the role that it sees itself as playing as that, shock satire, even when it's not as externalized as Guar or.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is a marker of the kind of genre overall, that it has this ability to criticize the more mainstream aspects of popular culture, and I think. But again, overall, I think it's often not interpreted that way. It's kind of like the message that goes unread in a lot of cases. We're seeing in Heavy Metal Parking Lot, the kind of stereotypical depiction really leaves nothing said below the surface, right? Like, even though there's a lot more going on artistically and kind of culturally there, all we see is the drunks in the parking lot, right? Which, I mean, not to take away from that, I mean, I've been to lots of shows where that's a great part of the community and of the culture, but I think that is something that often goes overlooked, not even, and beyond just in these very pointed kind of artists.
If you're saying that most or even all metal is kind of reactionary in that sense, what would you say about the types of metal that don't have vocals?
Well, I think that, this is kind of where the difficulties of assigning genre at all kind of come up, right? In that case, it does become, I guess, more specifically about the technical merits of the music, when there's no kind of explicit lyric or narrative, you only have the sounds, then that kind of confines you more to taking it as strictly a musical form rather than as a larger kind of commentary, I guess.
Sarah?
I would just have a question for you, but I would also add that the absence of lyrics from metal doesn't take away its sense of performativity and the philosophy behind the music at all. So you still have that presence, and you still have sometimes even a more deeper sense of the grotesque with the absence of voice. And that's done purposefully it's completely on purpose to not have a vocalist. And it also kind of deepens, I think it might deepen the meaning when it comes to like the sense of performativity and the relation to grotesque and the furthering away from mainstream that band would get. Right?
Yeah. I mean, I imagine I'm not very well versed, I guess, in that kind of metal per se, but I can imagine how the strength of a theater or performance without that kind of lyrical content could be even more kind of vivid.
Right, because and as an audience member, your experience with the performance is much different because your focus is taken away from the vocalist.
Yeah.
And you actually have to work at understanding the music a little bit more. Great. So I wonder sort of what role race plays in this narrative overall, because you start with Bowie, who totally ripped off Sun Ra, who identified himself as a Saturnarian and was really a big part of the underground poets of the Black Panther movement, and sort of in the mid to late 60s, and it never really got any recognition because it wasn't shocking for people of color to perform in this way, in the same way that, sort of we get George Clinton and Parliament and the mothership connection and the idea around the connection between sort of understanding the motherland from the mothership, and so that becomes a narrative for Black identity and doesn't sort of seep into white mainstream culture, so there's no shock about it because white people don't have to deal with it. And so then we have, all of a sudden it's shocking when someone like Alice Cooper or David Bowie, and I'm like, love David Bowie. But I'm still going to criticize him. But when David Bowie, especially sort of with The Man Who Fell to Earth film, if you haven't seen it, you should all watch this movie.
It's bizarre.
It's a free show, but it's great. And then that, it's sort of the characterization of whiteness and grotesque in performance kind of gives a very particular historical narrative absent of Black identity, which was kind of already doing that for a much different reason, right? To sort of mobilize Black people and to push them to visibility on the one hand, but it's almost like, do you expect that? You don't expect it, so it becomes threatening when white people do it. Because that narrative eventually produces heavy metal parking lot in a way. I mean, we can easily make the jump, but there's a connection there. So I just wonder, like, if that came up for you, or if you think you're thinking about maybe exploring that as a sort of connection.
It's not something that I considered a lot when putting this together, but I think that is an excellent point, that there is a kind of specificness to a kind of white culture. Just as you were talking, though, I was thinking Marilyn Manson's second album, Smells Like Children, actually did also include a cover of Screaming Jay Hawkins' I Put a Spell on You, which is kind of another throwback to, the origins of shock and of that kind of narrative. And also Patti Smith's song Rock and Roll Nigger was also covered on that album. And kind of, I don't know if you call it maybe ironically, but that song that was kind of about being apart from society in a way. I mean, it was, in a lot of Marilyn Manson shows, it was protested against as being a racial slur. Whereas, so I mean, the kind of race element, I think, has entered into it at times, or kind of maybe a nationality element, but kind of misunderstood, misappropriated,
Except that Patty Smith
misapplied.
would say that because she's white. Sort of. So the idea. So if you see that, if you've ever seen the film Afropunk, I also highly recommend about blacks in punk rock.
Okay.
He starts out the film and it says it's just text and it says, I should know this because I've taught it 100 times. In the 1970s, a white poet wrote the following, and outside of what has to go outside of society is where I want to be.
Yeah.
Something like that, and then rock and roll nigger, but he emphasizes want. So he talks about the idea. So look, that's good for you because you get to want to be outside of society. So that her role as a white person, and this is not taking away from her gender in the punk. It wasn't even punk rock, but at the time, in this scene, he was arguing, and this is a black artist arguing that it's a privilege for that lyric itself is a privilege because she uses the word want. Yeah. Rather than, like these black kids. And then he says that this film is dedicated to all the black kids who are outside of society and who have been called nigger. Yeah. And so he makes a very pointed kind of stab at her and at that lyric, specifically because of the way that she uses the word want. Yeah. So,
I find it...
Sorry, we're already 15 minutes behind. And we have some time towards the end of the day for more free form discussion of the ideas and things that come up in the talks. But if we fall too far behind, we won't have time for that. And also, part of what happens is towards the end of the day we have a kind of a tight schedule. The movie at Cinecenta has to be at 5:15 because they have a movie following it. The show starts at 7, and which is going to be pretty much right after the movie. So if we get too far behind, the things that are kind of structured will start to seep in. And so I'm going to move on to our next speaker. Thank you, Martha. That was great.
Thank you so much.